Hi there, it's Bronwyn. Last week I brought forward an earlier episode on food access as we had a number of new listeners join the podcast, and access and agency are both critical parts of your eating blueprint. They're essential to understand if you're trying to make sense of your food story and eating system. And in one sense, food access and agency are really two sides of the same coin. Access is about whether food was available and whether you could have it, and agency is about choice, authority, and autonomy. And that means whether you could choose what to eat, how much to eat, or when to eat, or whether those decisions were being made entirely by someone else. Food agency is one of those pieces that sits under the radar, but it has a lasting effect on how you eat. It becomes part of that eating system that shows up later, often in ways that look like overeating, over-catering, and difficulty with portion sizing, all of which can drive weight regain. So before we go further with the 10 women's food stories, this is the second piece to have in place. If you have any questions as you're listening, you can email me at hello@waitingforhappiness.com.au. So this is about agency. Listen in. Hi there. Welcome back to Before Dieting. This is the second episode in a two-part series about food access and agency in childhood. In the last episode, we talked about access, and that was looking at whether you could get food freely between your daily meals. And I covered how restricted food access can create secret eating behaviours that follow you into adulthood. So today, we're going to talk about the other side of the coin, and that's food agency. If a woman experienced little or no choice over what she ate as a child, there are two common ways it shows up when she's an adult. One is she doesn't trust herself around food, and the other is she has trouble with serving sizes. Not trusting herself around food, well, that can look like eating the whole packet instead of only the 2 biscuits that you intended to eat. And the trouble with serving sizes, it can show up in another 2 ways, and that's large portions on the plate or over-catering when you're feeding others. Diet culture would judge this as self-sabotage or failure of willpower, where eating systems view would be to ditch the judgment and go deep into understanding the level of food autonomy at the childhood dinner table. And that's because the dinner table is not just where you ate. It's where you formed the foundation of your relationship with food and eating. It's where you learned about who held food authority and what choices you could make. Thinking back to your own childhood meals, were you allowed to choose the food that went on your plate? Were you allowed to stop eating when you were full? And what about, were you able to refuse a food that you didn't like or leave food on the plate? If a parent or caregiver decided everything for you, you won't have learnt the skills and acquired the knowledge of feeding yourself properly. But what you will have learnt through this experience is compliance. And compliance looks like good eating when you're being watched, but it often collapses when you're alone. One of the other myths that I hear is that adults should know about portions. Well, if you grew up in a house where your meals were controlled, if you were expected to eat just what was put in front of you and your choices weren't included, it doesn't really create options for learning. And then this goes on to create a paradox in adulthood where a woman can raise children, run a household, manage work, make complex decisions, but still feel strangely unskilled at feeding herself. And unfortunately, in these situations, the common response to this not knowing for many women is shame. But to feel shame is completely off target. And why should a woman feel shame? Because she wasn't taught something or because she didn't get any practice at it? It's not logical. Food portioning is a skill. And when you're young, activities that build the skill come from things like being able to serve yourself or being trusted when you say that you're full, and also being allowed to leave food when you don't want to eat it or you are full. There's another byproduct of growing up with low food agency as well, and that's where women hand over control to something external. Because they experienced childhoods where they were given the rules and told what was going to happen and told what they were going to eat, they often need rules now to follow, and which is why diet plans can feel so appealing. But rules don't create agency, but they certainly can override it for a time. But sooner or later, the system pushes back. And this is why women eat differently in front of others. Reduced agency often creates sensitivity about eating in front of people. That's why so many women alter their eating in front of others, but then eat more later when they're alone. Again, coming back to diet culture, they would call this self-sabotage. But if as a child your eating was corrected or policed, you learned eating as something you can get wrong. So in public, you eat carefully. And then later, away from the eyes of everyone, when your system tries to restore relief, and you get that control through private eating. But I really want to make clear, this is not a weakness, it's actually using an old solution. So hopefully by now you can see how food access and agency are really welded together. Because if food autonomy wasn't allowed for you openly, then you will have created it privately. And that shouldn't be called shameful, it should actually be labelled that it's survival. So if you're listening to this, you're probably focused on today's body weight, which makes sense. But I want to make clear that the blueprint creating today's eating might have started 20 or 30 years ago, possibly even longer. We need to bring a good understanding, a clear understanding of what your eating system and blueprint is working from, because it's certainly not present day. It's like reading the last chapter of a book and try to make sense of the story without knowing it's a romance novel or a true crime. You have to go back to the beginning because permanent weight loss requires root cause work, not just another diet. Not more rules, not more tracking, not even another diet with a new personality. Because if you haven't unpacked what created the system, it will keep delivering the same outcome. And that's the reason I created the Waiting for Happiness project. It's actually purpose-built to change that. It's a structured investigation where you track the patterns, decode the rules, and map your eating system. Because permanent weight change requires you knowing the why and not just treating the what. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk with you next week.